You are listening to the Unusually Well-Informed podcast.
Welcome to the Unusually Well-Informed podcast. I'm your host, Tim Hampton. My unusually well-informed guest today is Robert Jacobson. Robert is an entrepreneur, advisor, and space advocate who believes that space holds the key to humanity's successful future. Robert is the founder of Space Advisors, a space and financial consulting firm for space startups. Today, Robert and I will be discussing his book titled Space is Open for Business, the Industry That Can Transform Humanity. Robert, welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you, Tim.
You call space an industry that can transform humanity. What transformation do you anticipate in the near future?
Well, I think the first thing that we're going to start seeing is, people being in space at some sort of scale. It's always been kind of single digits. And once we start having more regular non-professional astronauts going from, just, single digits to maybe then dozens of people, they're going to be spreading the message about whether it's the overview effect of how amazing the Earth is, or maybe they were fortunate enough to take a trip around the moon. But we have, I think it's being proposed by that Japanese individual through SpaceX, who's going to bring along some artists and other creative types to start telling that story about kind of both the beauty of the Earth, the majesty of the solar system. And then also in parallel, we've got some really amazing things going on the satellite side. Just as we have, we all have like some sort of little mobile device. It's gotten very powerful. Same thing has happened in the satellite sector with miniaturization of electronics. And what started off as academic projects, there were these things called CubeSats, and they were called CubeSats because the form factor was basically 10 by 10 by 10 centimeters. And it was thought just to be a way to give kind of bench work for students in university, a space-related project. And then people started to fly those. And then some industries, people said, hey, could we aggregate these and maybe get something really powerful out of that? And that's what you're starting to see, these smaller satellites that are going to provide, whether it's new types of optical or spectral data, RF monitoring, weather monitoring. Really, the sky's the limit. And we know that our planet is changing, so we definitely need an increased amount of sensors and higher amount of granularity so we can hopefully make more informed decisions about how we're behaving and misbehaving here.
That's an interesting thread that you really emphasize in the book is, we tend to think of, or it is easy to think of space industry as an investment in space. But of course, the investment is intended to improve life on Earth, not just, we can anticipate a distant future where we're colonizing space, but really it's directed towards Earth again, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. It's great to think about the future and plan for the future, but we can really only be in the present right now. And space is sometimes tricky concept for people. It's both easy and difficult. It can cause some real cognitive dissonance because you can't touch it. There's a lot of invisible aspects to it. But it's really not that far away. The border of space, the international consensus is about 100 kilometers above sea level. So it's really not that far away, but it's very difficult to get to. And only a few hundred individuals on the planet Earth have ever visited, and a few non-humans. So it sometimes just, it's kind of like that intangible aspect. However, we all can go out at night, or most of us, if we live in a fairly, let's find a place with some dark skies, see whether we're going to see the moon, see some stars and other planets. So we all have that shared experience through the millennia of being influenced by, the night sky.
One of the things that's happening now that really is changing, I want to say landscape, but of course that doesn't apply to space, but the situation is it's so much cheaper to fly to space now. What are some of the projects underway that are changing the economics of actually getting payload to orbit?
Well, you have kind of rapid reiteration, and that's probably one of the chief proponents of that would be a company like SpaceX, which is, not afraid to fail, operates very high tempo. They have system that works very well. Their Falcon 9 that they're commercially flying many satellites successfully at high tempo, high success rate, and then using revenue and investment money to pepper investments in all sorts of other projects, like their Starlink satellite project, their Starship, which in their kind of heavy lift capacity there. And you have companies like in Southern California, Relativity Space, which is attempting to mostly build a rocket out of additive manufacturing, being 3D printing almost the entire rocket. They've not flown yet, but they're kind of setting a potential new kind of, I guess it's the base of, where you can be for a space company, and that what that would translate to is potentially less people needed to actually build the rocket. Humans can be used for other aspects of in that ecosystem, maybe building rockets faster, more reliably, different sizes. You've got other companies like Rocket Lab out of, I guess you could say they're in some ways, are they really a Kiwi company or are they a US company? Because they kind of have aspects of both. I think they kind of play both sides, but they've already been flying successfully commercial payloads. So there's other launch companies out there internationally that are probably trying to keep up, I think, with several of those. So we'll see. I think there's still opportunities for a few others, but I'm not sure we'll see 100+ launch companies like there currently are being able to commercially survive.
One of the fascinating aspects when you contrast a company like SpaceX and Rocket Lab, they are sort of taking the viewpoint that they're like a taxi. I think you even say this in your book. It's more like a taxi. It takes you to exactly the orbit you want to be in, but you have a small payload. But it also, because it's a small rocket, you can sort of choose when you go as well. Whereas SpaceX is really about cost per pound to orbit. We'll just put you into orbit as cheaply as possible, large amounts. They may have a fast cadence, but you still have to wait to be on one of a launch with multiple satellites. What do you think of those two aspects? Do you see them both surviving? Do you see a cause for both?
I think they'll be somewhere in the middle because I've met with companies that are working on the smaller launch. They will say that they are the counterpoint to a SpaceX philosophy, that there are customers who really need to get to a dedicated place in orbit at a specific, or as close as you can in terms of timing, and because many times you might be on a manifest and you might be delayed, with other, if you're ride sharing, which is, for people who don't know, basically you're piggybacking on the primary customer. So you might have like a big, say satellite TV, synchronous satellite going up, and they'll put some secondary customers on. So they don't really get to go exactly where they want to be or when they want to be, but it's a lot less expensive. So yeah, I do think there'll be a place for both. It'll also be I'm personally curious to see how the launch sites are going to evolve over time. You see many places trying to create spaceports. They typically tend to be around coasts for the obvious reasons of, it's just a little less riskier. You don't want to crash, have your rocket crash and potentially, cause harm to people or buildings. But there are a few inland ones that are being developed, and I'll be curious to see, can they get to an operational place in terms of all the local regulations, rightly so. I think, that, where I think Texas, maybe Oklahoma, they're talking about one. Forget the one in Scotland, if that's inland or not.
Yeah. Well, and one of the challenges is they all are most effective when they're near the equator, and there's only so many locations next to water on the equator.
Yeah.
Do you see SpaceX seems to be approaching this like they're recognizing that living next to a launch site will be about as much fun as living next to an airport after a while. You're going to have all these sonic booms and these enormous rockets going up. Do you see floating platforms for launch being a regular solution to that?
perhaps, and there, I know there's companies looking at sea, kind of call it ocean-based launch. So yeah, it's definitely a possibility. Again, I will start wondering when it comes to sea launch, are there going to be issues that we've not yet thought about? I mean, I don't know. Maybe there's maybe a whale population living there and it's disturbing them. Maybe, there's always these things. Humans do a pretty good job of, coming up with this really smart idea. We're going to like launch this rocket. It's going to be 10 miles off the coast. It's not going to bother anybody. Great light show. But there always seems to be these things that we'll eventually forget about, that we'll have to kind of go out there and do, and you try and experiment and realize maybe it doesn't go quite as planned. So it'll be interesting to see how the evolution of especially sea launch progresses. But there was the commercial sea launch provider called Sea Launch. They had a pretty rocky life. It was, Ukrainian, Russian company, US. And then at one point when it was kind of owned by both, I mean, like on the boat, there was like a divider, the kind of the Russians couldn't go to the US side. The US couldn't go to the Russian side. There was monitors. That doesn't seem like a very efficient way to conduct business.
It sounds like an I Love Lucy episode. I'm pretty sure there was one where they drew a line down the center of the room.
Yeah.
Yeah. So when you talk about, because one thing I think we can agree on is there's going to be a whole lot more stuff being launched into space. And so what used to be a drop in the bucket is now like, a cup in the bucket, like it's becoming more impactful in terms of the environmental concerns. Do you see that affecting the fuel choice? Because right now, you have hydrogen, kerosene, methane, all these different varieties, and they all have a different impact on the environment. Do you see that maybe the EPA, for example, would get involved and say you have to use this type of fuel, not that kind?
I'm really not sure. And I know there's been a little more focus on recently, since you had some suborbital space launches in July 2021. So there were people, there was a little more attention brought to that. But there's been some interesting looks saying like say SpaceX's Starship, you'd have to fly it an incredible number of times to get to any type of impact close to, say, commercial airline travel.
Right.
So I think at smaller scale, it's not going to be an issue. They're going to learn what works. They'll improve. In terms of regulatory, I'm not sure.
But you do raise in the book, and I thought this was I don't think it was, I think you were quoting somebody, but it was blue skies, not red tape. And it was sort of a rallying cry around the idea that right now regulation hasn't caught up with space launches and space activity. Where do you see that headed?
Well, I mean, I think that's almost you could probably say that for most governing bodies, public institutions. They were set up, whether it's your municipal waste, your electricity, these things were set up a long time ago, and the technology and sort of the current trends outpace what an agency can do. And what's happened in the space agency, where they don't have enough people to process the licensing, whether it's for satellites or for launch. There's a lot of paperwork kind of on both sides. And there are probably ways that things like software could help improve, or at least augment what's currently going on in that kind of on the government regime side. So I think government will be forced. It's going to be a struggle they're going to be dragged along. It's like, look, who still uses fax machines? It's like your doctor's offices, hospitals, government agencies, right? Maybe a few others, but I think some of what is happening in space is going to require government to kind of improve some processes.
One of the interesting regulation challenges is with all the stuff going into orbit and going into space in general, you wind up with a debris problem. Where do you see hopeful signs there? Because it's bad for everyone, right? It's bad for people who want to launch now because they will be restricted on what they can put up, but also people who are already up there, like, don't ram stuff into our satellites.
Yeah, I mean, pretty much anything moving up there could be a kinetic weapon in space. So to unpack there, I think one on the Earth side, a personal belief would be great to see a global anti-satellite weapons ban. whether that's from missiles launched from aircraft or space to space. So just further trying to give at least maybe optically the appearance that, hey, the world is against weaponization of space or kind of tactical warfare against satellites. Things that still need to be decided in terms of cleaning up space junk is, you have nascent efforts. Some allege that they are commercial on different methods to clean out space junk. I don't think it's going to be a one size fits all. But even if you find a few things that work, you then have to convince that owner of that spacecraft that even though it's inactive and maybe even inert, why you're going to let this third party come and maybe deorbit it, recycle it, use it, because you might have some that say, hey, there's proprietary technology, we don't want you to see it. There could be a variety of reasons. So I think there's going to have to be some negotiation there on how we're going to cross.
And that's interesting too, because it raises the question of who has authority in space. Who would be involved in that kind of discussion?
Well, there's discussions at a UN level, but they're not really, the UN doesn't really, they're not an enforcement agency. So what I come back to is locks are for honest people. And I think we're just going to have to find a way, I think, either in between parties. Maybe it's going to just start with company to company, NASA to ESA, NASA to JAXA, or it's going to maybe have to start literally organization to organizational level before it gets to something that seems more global.
Well, and probably, unfortunately, it will come up with somebody's expensive satellite gets wiped out by somebody else.
I mean, at some point, maybe soon, I could envision seeing sort of an international, like kind of starts as a consortium, like as a conference, and then becomes some sort of trade group to kind of like, they'll study the problem, they'll propose solutions, they'll want the government to pay for it. They'll be, they'll gladly, commercial sector will gladly have like the solution for it. So I think that's my guess on how we might start to see, along with, potential accident that will accelerate some of the.
Yeah, maybe all it'll take is a near miss, but we keep having near misses, right?
How many near misses
on the space station, the International Space Station got punctured, right?
Yeah, like how many near misses are you going to have until it's like it's not a near miss, it's an impact.
It's an actual collision. Yeah. Near disaster, I guess, is the correct term in that case, because if that had been through somebody's helmet or something like that.
Yeah.
So you hear doomsday scenarios about once you have, it's almost like nuclear fission, right? It's fine in low density, it's just like a Geiger counter going off. But when you have enough density, it becomes like a nuclear explosion. And the same sort of that metaphor applies to what happens when two satellites collide. They distribute so much debris that it can hit so many other satellites until you get a chain reaction. I think, is it called Kessler effect? Is that
is it Kepler? Wait, maybe the Kepler effect, and I'm forgetting. We can maybe fact check that. But okay. Yes, there's a syndrome. There's a sort of a syndrome. You gotta have a syndrome, even up in space. I mean, look, you've got your child's. It's always great when you have like your child's Legos. They've built their truck there, but they don't want to keep it there together that long. Inevitably, they're going to take it apart, and there's a million little pieces scattered around, and you think you got them all, and a couple months later, you go, ouch, you stepped on something.
So we'll call it the Lego syndrome. I like it. Yeah, but you're not alarmed that, like, to me that sounds like an unlikely scenario. It's sort of the doomsday scenario.
Yeah, I mean that's probably extreme, but I think it's worth thinking about things at the full range of the scale that we're able to envision, even if we're going to miss some areas in between, and maybe even. But yeah, maybe that's going to be the very worst, maybe highly unlikely to happen. But I think it's, in general, our species needs to do just better job of being proactive in planning. I mean, we're kind of dealing, when we look at like, Spaceship Earth, and there were all these things that they said that were like, these different studies Club of Rome, and they thought it was crazy in the 70s and 80s and 90s. For many years, these groups were decried, and now they're going, a lot of that's all true. Maybe we should do a better job of listening to our scientists and those who are experts in a specific area.
Well, I agree. And then, of course, that's one of the things as well in the book that you really emphasize is the big eye in the sky is important to us having a fact-based discussion on what's happening on the Earth. Do you want to talk about that? Like get into the environment and crop yields and that sort of thing?
So, space, space is difficult. So I don't think we have to do everything in space. It's like, why do we have airplanes sometimes, or I'll maybe start on the ground. You maybe have someone who maybe works for the city, and they're walking down blocks and they're looking for overusage of water. They're counting lawns. Maybe they're estimating pools. You could go up and use a drone with that. It's easy, but it only covers a certain amount of territory. You've got battery issues. You can use an airplane or helicopter. That has its own limitations, but certainly good when you're needing some regional things and something maybe just kind of quick and dirty. And then you go up to higher altitude platforms and then eventually out into space, and you get this really unique vantage point. And it's not just putting essentially telescopes to look down on the ground. You can put other suites of sensors. You can look at the emissions from power plants. You can look at the weather. You can even look at radio frequencies. How some areas are noisier than others. There's many different ways we can sort of listen to and observe the Earth for commercial, financial benefits, social planning. Migratory, the list is numerous. And before, the assets were very expensive. You're putting up a large satellite, several $100 million. You have to, but now with these smaller satellites, that can be. It all depends on like how much you're putting on there. But let's just say they're not. You can get a constellation of satellites, a group of them for maybe under $100 million, calling them single-digit millions, sometimes hundreds of thousands each. It just, again, depends on what you're loading those satellites up with high performance and high capability. Maybe not as high as a dedicated one in a geosynchronous orbit, but still very high performance. So, we're now, dealing with these issues like how to feed the planet, how do we, dealing with pollution mitigation issues, forest fires, the list is numerous, but you can use these sensors to inform our decision making. And just the raw data is not necessarily helpful. This is where you bring in your AI and your other complementary computer technology, software technologies that can help provide an assistant to the analytics that's going on, so you can have better insights to whatever you're observing. I just spent some time in the Pacific Northwest, and every issue on the planet has its own kind of regional things they're dealing with, and there were some surrounding areas dealing with fires, and I was expecting the smoke to kind of blow into where we were staying, but they actually ended up blowing all the way to the east coast of North America, and they were dealing with smoke all the way from the west coast of North America. So we're all interlinked, and using satellite assets could better help where the smoke particulates are going, what are they affecting. And you alluded to like farming. If we can improve how we're using, better management of the land, and you can use things like hyperspectral data where you're able to see in other parts of the light spectrum, so you can look for, it's like disease and proper water usage. So we can really kind of, I guess, better fine-tune the human activities that currently work, or some of them don't work, or don't work super well, just better fine-tune things.
How exciting would it be? I imagine there's already efforts underway to see the forest fire right when it starts.
Yeah, there was a project a few years ago that my friend Rex Reitnauer was a part of, that called FireSat, and it was just too soon. They wanted to put some satellites up to look for fires just as they started, and it was a little too soon. I think maybe there's maybe a reemergence of a project like that, maybe totally different group. But yeah, I could see that where you could just see right where the fire starts.
So we've talked a little bit about what I'll call the big eye in the sky. There's also the big antenna in the sky, right? The big relay. So we have TV satellites and communication satellites. Let's talk a little bit about Starlink, which is a project by SpaceX. I think it's an interesting example because it's sort of the extreme example of a constellation. I think they're aiming for over 40,000 satellites. Can you talk about the pros and cons of that and how that impacts space debris?
Well, I mean, we've never done that many satellite. I mean, no one organization's ever put that many satellites, and that's more satellites than we have ever launched.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
it breaks a lot of records. But the promise of Starlink is that it will be able to deliver kind of broadband access to the entire planet, which is great. There's a lot of positives there because we don't yet, much of the planet still doesn't have internet access. There's still remote areas and plenty, Western countries that have spotty internet. So that would be, you could imagine, especially places where you're dealing with issues of poverty. When you start being able to bring in things like better remote access to remote telemedicine and education, that can potentially be a game changer for that region or country. The challenges around, satellites colliding or becoming space junk. I mean, I know SpaceX, they're very cognizant of those pressures, and they're even putting. People are concerned about them causing pollution in the skies, being able to affect astronomers' visibility and they've been basically building these sunshades on the satellites. Now, I don't really know the total what SpaceX plans to do in terms of replacement of satellites, or as they become, they need to replace them with just newer satellites. There's some concern that some of the materials in the satellites, if you started bringing these satellites back and burning them up, could cause some potential issues with the ozone layer that should be addressed. I'm not quite sure how are they going to have to build satellites in a different material. I'm not sure, but it definitely should be looked at and addressed.
Yeah, there are a couple of aspects to the low orbit that are interesting, right? One is that you don't wind up with forever debris. It'll come down quicker. And then the other is the distance to the satellite is lower, so your latency, the delay in a signal. You know the old news reports are like, so tell us about the weather, and there's that 3-beat count while you're waiting for a response. You don't get that with this, do you?
Well, I don't know how many milliseconds the delay will be. You're still dealing with the speed of light, but it'll be. I play music, and I was thinking, oh man, maybe it'll be great to be able to do co-located music production, which has been very elusive. And there are only a few universities, I think, like North America, all tied into this thing called the Internet 2, and they're using fiber optic. And there's almost unnoticeable, so you can do rhythmic types of music, but you're not going to be able to do that with Starlink, unfortunately. It's still a little too long. So I've been curious about it, but it could be a game changer for whether you're on an island, a mountain. I hope it proceeds.
Yeah,
it continues to proceed.
For the last 2 years, I imagine you've been able to work from home for the majority of the last 2 years.
Yes.
And I have as well. And that's revolutionary. I mean, if it weren't for the unfortunate circumstances we find ourselves in, a lot of people wouldn't even know they could work from home. But now it's getting to the point where you can work from anywhere. I mean, if you have access to a Starlink station, you're in business.
Yeah, one of my colleagues got an early Starlink. He's using it. I think he's using it in New Hampshire. They have a little mountain place, and it works. He says it's working reasonably well. But humans move. We're not going to be able to prevent us from moving around. But I think things like the pre-pandemic ways of commuting is just such a inefficient use of time. And of course, there's some things that just need to be done in a group of people, but Do people need to spend 4 or 5 or 6 days a week kind of meeting all together? I'm not so sure about that. Of course, it's industry dependent and all very dependent, but I think there's many industries where we can change the work norms.
Yeah, for sure. What do you see any parallels between the rapid increase of activity in space and the dot-com boom? Like, is there a reckoning coming where there's so much activity that there has to be a bit of a bust?
I've thought about that. I'm not sure. I think maybe some of the differences is that in the first internet.com, some of the companies had only it was like a vague business plan and no idea how they were going to produce revenue. It was like, okay, I have I have grapefruit.com. I don't know what we're going to do, but we love grapefruit, and people said, wow, it had .com. They'd go public, first day of trading, $500 million of valuation at the time, which was, a lot, or maybe $1 billion. But no great idea on like how they're going to keep the lights on.
Right.
I think most space companies, even the ones that are dealing with new markets, have at least a better idea, and their investors are somewhat cautious. Most investors are, they're tend to ask their entrepreneurs and the founders to meet milestones before they re-up and invest more.
It does surprise me a little bit. I mean, other than SpaceX, which is a real media darling, I don't think too many day traders are necessarily aware of the space industry. They're more likely to invest in a storefront video game retail outlet than they are in space. So maybe it's early days yet and the boom hasn't really started.
Yeah, that's true. People are playing financial arbitrage, and it's not so much they care about GameStop, the game. It's really just more about what little slice they're going to make off of some type of financial transaction. Yeah. They're not really looking at the fundamentals.
So how could one invest in space? Because I know right now SpaceX is privately traded, right? Or privately held, excuse me.
Yeah, and there's there are ways to get in on like those sort of early investment, but it's I just saw one last week. There was like up to $20 million opportunity to invest in SpaceX through like a kind of a secondary fund. But I think the current price per share, it's eye-opening. It's, so I think if one was a Main Street investor and they're looking just have a little call this throwaway money, they can lose it, not making, if it were me, not making investments in Vice, but just this is just anecdotal. Look at some of the exchange traded funds out there, because they hold a broad range of companies, and some of them will be aerospace focused, not just space focused, and that is they're generally affordable per share. They're diversified. Is something that would be a way to kind of start getting into. And we're starting to see, and this is, I think, what's going to be exciting is, some of these there's other groups like these SPAC methods of going public. So there's space companies, of which space is interested. There's lots of companies that are trying to find new ways to get themselves funded.
Right. Well, let's talk about your role in the industry a little bit. You're the founder of a venture called Space Advisors. What role does that company play?
So Space Advisors was set up to be an advisory company for a few select startups, but also organizations that are looking to seek to create a strategy utilizing space or for space. Because you can imagine there's lots of companies that might be saying, okay, we know who Elon Musk, Richard Branson, but Jeff Bezos they're all interested in space, but how does this affect us? Does this affect us? So we're interested in facilitating, helping companies understand how they can both participate and how they can be doing better planning for this coming, it's sort of like this, the space revolution is happening. We just don't know it, or most of us just don't know it.
Right.
And I say that politely. I'm
Yeah.
not trying. I'm not trying to like put down people like insiders, outsiders. It's just, it's a bit like the dotcom. Everybody said, okay, I can have a website. I can have a business card. People understand satellites are necessary. Banking transactions. But really, how else is it going to affect me? And they don't realize that there's many visible, invisible ways daily that benefits of space, whether it's things that were done through like tech transfer. They were developed, through public space agencies and were spun off, or that the innovations that the private sector is making. And it's not just going to be about launching satellites. I think we're going to be seeing innovations around eventually around in the material sciences area, life sciences, manufacturing, and that those will have direct benefits for us here on Earth.
Yeah, that is an exciting thread. And that is that if you can do something in space, it's inevitably a better way than you would do it on Earth. Like, you really have to put your thinking cap on to get something done at all in space. And once you figure out that method, it could be very useful on Earth. And that's one of the arguments in favor of NASA. I forget the exact figure, but I think you were saying something along the lines of, there's X many dollars of economic activity produced by an investment in NASA, for example.
Yeah, well, that's range. That's a very, there's been a few studies done over the years, and that's it's tricky. How did they quantify that? And there's like a range. It's like $3 to $14, but the takeaway is it's not that specific range. It's that there was a positive number that was given back. It wasn't that NASA doesn't put the U.S. taxpayer in the red. It actually gives back. And then there's the ancillary benefits that are, countless.
So let's talk about, what do you see the role for national space agencies like NASA now that space has drawn the attention of entrepreneurs? It's a commercial venture a lot of the time. What role should NASA play?
I think NASA can do more, advanced technology development, exploration. There's things like deep space missions, interplanetary missions with robots. That groups like JPL lead. That they do. They're practically peerless. They're that outstanding. They continue to do that. Focus on the really early, technology advancement and development, and exploration, and continue to become in terms of things like commercial crew and the space station. Continue to kind of work in this transitory role of being a customer to some of these people. NASA, it's had astronauts successfully fly now on U.S.-made commercial spaceships, SpaceX. And this isn't all that new. Used to see, great. You look at some of these older photographs, and you'd see people in their bunny suits or their white suits in the clean rooms. And there were always corporate logos over at Rockwell or Boeing or whatever company. Yeah. So the corporate sector has always been of service. It was a kind of an elite club. Now the club has kind of gotten a little larger, and there's new entrants.
Yeah, and the private companies are playing much more of almost like an OEM role, like in the manufacture of cars. They're building the whole shebang, whereas before they were building just subsystems.
You know what? You broke up there, Tim. Could you repeat that question?
I'm sorry. I was just saying that. Am I okay now?
Yes.
I was just saying that one of the differences between the Apollo era, for example, and what we see today in what you call Space 2.0, it's this new commercialization of space, is in the Apollo era, they were all subcontractors. They weren't integrators, like a car manufacturer, an OEM builds the whole car as a private enterprise. Now you're seeing that with SpaceX and companies like that. They're coming out with the whole mission almost.
Yeah.
It's a big change. But that does raise a question. Dan, I don't know if you saw this tweet on Twitter from Dan Rather, who said the space race of the 1960s was fueled by American taxpayers. This space race is fueled by non-taxpayers. Did you see that Twitter?
No,
So
non-tax.
what he's picking on there is this idea that people are objecting this billionaire space race. Do you share that concern?
Um, I think, okay, there's a few things to address here. Is that um, yes, some high profile, high net worth people do silly things like all of us. They say things in public, things that they probably realize it was kind of dumb. They can sometimes be a little tone deaf. They can be arrogant. They can spend money on really foolish things. But the fact that there are a few individuals that are investing in things that look like science fiction is impressive. There's been plenty of other high net worth people. There were people before Elon Musk who could have tried to do a SpaceX, but the time wasn't right. I mean, you had Beal from Beal Bank who basically tried doing something kind of like SpaceX before, and then NASA wouldn't work with him. The timing wasn't right, so he stopped investing in it. And Elon even purchased some of those assets from Jeff Beal. Why don't people give the guy, and I can't think of his name, the chairman or the family that owns all those luxury brands in France, like Louis Vuitton? His family's worth like a couple $100 billion US. Yeah. I don't know I'm sure he gives money to some charities or whatever, but he's not being, the media selectively picks on the people right now that are focused on space because they somehow are a little jealous. So what if Branson and Bezos wanted to be one of the first on something that they helped fund? I mean, hey, it's their butt. They could have been killed on it, but they probably had a pretty good assurance that they were likely to survive. I don't think they would have actually gone on those flights, is my personal assessment. I think we need more high net worth people investing in science activities. And some will say, well, Virgin or Blue Origin is not really doing a lot of science yet. Well, in fact, they have actually been taking some payloads. Blue Origin had been flying scientific payloads on their uncrewed flights for some time. So there is, the people are just seeing the short-term joyride. Mm-hmm. They're actually not seeing what the long-term vision. And actually, if they're even just taking a joyride, if we break down that word, a joyride means you're taking a ride to have fun and joy. I would rather be having people be in more joy than like more pain. So I think, as much as initially this part of the space race might be most afforded by those who are going to either grant people who can't afford the tickets to fly, or the people can afford to write the checks. But that is eventually going to open up as the prices continue to come down. The goal is not just to keep this as a small exclusive club. Going back to, and again, I'm just trying to state different points. It's not necessarily in pure defense of any one person, but I know, Bezos back in 1982, he was graduating from his high school, and he was a valedictorian. In his speech, he was talking about wanting to do activities related to space. Yeah. He had read Jerry O'Neill's The High Frontier, excellent book, which is also, there's a documentary about the late Jerry O'Neill's life. And Jerry O'Neill basically saw that we could build these large structures in space, he envisioned thousands of people living, and these stations would have artificial gravity. He also is a proponent of using solar energy to power those space stations. And we could say that probably Bezos and many hundreds, if not thousands of other people who are in or around the space industry have been directly influenced by Professor Jared K. O'Neill's vision. And so if people like Dan Rather want to understand further, get to the roots and really, read or understand Gerard K. O'Neill's life, and you will understand what is kind of driving, people. And maybe in Elon, one of the big drivers for him was the Foundation book series. Mm-hmm. And a project I was part of that I'm part of called the Arc Mission Foundation. We actually took a disc of that book series, and we put it on a quartz disc, and we put it inside Elon Musk's Tesla Roadster that's now orbiting the sun.
Oh, that's amazing. I love that. Yeah. That's quite a story too, isn't it? The test payload for the Falcon Heavy, right?
Yeah. There was a few kind of Easter eggs. We were one of the Easter eggs on that
That's
flight.
awesome.
Yeah.
Well, tell me more about that. How did that project come to be?
So Arc Mission Foundation was kind of the brainchild of my colleague Nova Spivak. He's a prolific inventor and serial entrepreneur. And he had been kind of looking at for a number of years of what the current state of data storage is. And our civilization, things are very ephemeral, and civilizations only tend to last a few hundred years max. They tend to not last very long time. And we're still very impervious to floods and fires that just about every year a few libraries somewhere burn down. And it goes back to he had a very intense dream as a child about kind of like a sort of an end of civilization dream, and he's kind of carried that dream with him most of his life, that he felt he needed to start something to help kind of preserve human knowledge and culture. And that became the Arc Mission Foundation. We've flown, we've kind of scouted various technologies, and these are technologies that will last not thousands of years, but billions of years. And we're having the quartz disk technology was developed out of a university in the United Kingdom, and you can get several hundred terabytes and just I'm forgetting the exact, just under 50 grams. I mean, it's really small, these disks. The challenge though still is that to read or play back that disk, you need the entire lab. So in that way, it was, if somebody were to go out to Elon's Tesla Roadster and go in the glove compartment and get it, you'd have to have the lab at this point to be able to read the disk.
Maybe throw a manual in the glove box with it.
Yeah, but it'll last 10 plus billion years, the quartz. A more affordable technology that we're using a little more at scale at this moment is called nanofiche. It's a nickel-based technology, uses the metal nickel, and we can include both analog and digital data. And we're using nanolithography to actually etch into the nickel metal. And you can see, in terms of the analog data, with just a regular microscope, you can actually see with your own eye on there. So we put a nickel disk of about 30 to 30-ish million pages of data onto the Israeli lander, the Space IL. That's the brace sheet, and that's on the moon right now, of a vast variety of human knowledge and culture. So we've got a number of other missions planned. We've done some Earth missions too. So the idea is, and what we're actually doing is a robust and resilient and scalable way to start backing up Earth civilization.
So imagine you do the math and you come up with the perfect location in the solar system to put this backup of everything we already know, and you find that there's one from a previous civilization already there. That's basically Space 2001.
Yeah, but we think we need to have multiple ones. They need to be at Lagrange points, different. They need to be in both kind of obvious and non-obvious spots. And the non-obvious ones would be, in case there is a place in the future when, maybe the authorities, regimes don't want access to that. So we want to, you make sure that this is, safeguard against nature and humans.
Amazing. Well, speaking of humans, one of the things that happens when you commercialize something is eventually you militarize it too. So what is the role of the new U.S. military branch, Space Force, and what does this suggest for militarization of space coming to us?
Well, I had always been on the side that, in my initial thinking, is that we should have that at least the U.S. should have stood up something that looked more like a Coast Guard model. That maybe there could still be aspects of it that would look like that. But, the fact is that the U.S. has a lot of assets in space, both, not all of them are, the civilian, military, non-military. And Space Force's job is really going to be to protect that. It's going to also start, I think, monitoring, the space orbit, learning how to better deal with the orbital debris issue. So I think initially, they're not initially putting men and women in astronaut suits and having them flying around up there with guns. That's not happening, not anytime soon. That's not realistic. What's more likely to happen is that they're going to be just charged and tasked in dealing with those in space assets and how do they deal with the threats. Now that comes full circle going, what is defense in a space regime? If, let's just say, you've got your satellite there and you see someone might crash into you, moving it away is a fine thing, but how can you tell whether that was an accident or that was an intentionally made to maneuver the satellite to collide with the other one? So, and I don't know if the Space Force is probably the group that's going to be tasked to kind of like coming up with those rules, but they're going to be on the kind of the first line there.
So circling back to your role as an advisor, where do you see the low-hanging fruit for entrepreneurs in terms of getting involved in space? And also, where do you see the greatest opportunities for, let's say you're 25 years old or 20 years old and you want to get a degree and you want to get into space? What are the careers looking like?
Gosh, so I would say to somebody who's currently an entrepreneur or maybe just curious. First, I say, look in your own backyard. Mm-hmm. And when by that means it could be geographic in terms of what space activity is going on in your own city or area or town, wherever you're at, or university. And what are you currently involved with? Let's say you're involved with, insurance. You're in the insurance business. Look at, okay, how does the space industry work with the insurance business? And they do. And then you say, if you have some expertise or insider knowledge, maybe there's some other things going, is going to be a way to start, covering, an extended life insurance policy for human participants flying. There's lots of extensions that one can maybe make. So I would say try to just develop some analogs, even if it's just a thought exercise. Then if you do have or if one has an idea that they think this would be cool to create or commercialize, do some development on it, and not necessarily in product development, but in terms of user or customer development, so that you don't invest a whole lot of time into something that maybe someone currently won't necessarily use or care about or pay for. So spend some energy figuring out who is the customer. In terms of one who is a student, you can, there's lots of lists out there on like these future, the jobs of the future, jobs of space. I remember Wired magazine used to always print. I love that part. It was always at the last, or no, was it archaeology of the future, I think is what it was. They always had this page at the very back of the magazine about it was sort of future archaeology that didn't quite exist. And you can just imagine, if you're interested in humans, space experience, space flights, what types of, find out what, go back to what interests you. If you think you don't know what you want to do, you want to be in space and you like engineering, well, go into engineering. You don't even have to be an aerospace engineer. You can go in pretty much any branch of engineering could have a relevance to space. You're going to get some of the fundamentals, and then it's, you're going to go eventually train in something else if you're in some type of business or other areas. So I wouldn't stress too much about that. But for those who maybe are not necessarily inclined, who want to go to like an engineering school, that's where you can, start using, I'll call it some of the creative side and thinking about like, creating things that you're going to be, creating something that's using the infrastructure and tools and pieces that are being set up. It's not like, look at all how many these YouTubers or Instagram people are out there. Most of, I'm going to make let me say this politely. They did not build the technology they are using,
sure,
but they are very good. But they have done an excellent job. There are individuals, sometimes very young, who have made a lot of wealth for themselves sometimes more wealth than the people who are maybe on the front lines who are working a salaried job building one of these devices. And sure, they might have done okay, but there are then individuals who go, I know how to take this tool and really amplify it for my own use.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, I don't know if you're familiar with Tim Dodd, the everyday astronaut.
I am. I'm very impressed with his. I was just watching his tour of
Starbase.
Excuse me.
Yeah, I was impressed too, and that was why I was bringing it up, because here's a guy who interested in space, sharing that interest with an audience, and making a living out of it, and actually meeting Elon Musk directly. I know you've met Elon Musk.
Mm-hmm.
What were the circumstances of that?
I think there was two different small tours. One was at the very first their first original location in Manhattan Beach, or it was or El Segundo, excuse me, which is next to Manhattan Beach, which is so small. I was like, and what they were building, I was like, and then at the Hawthorne location, and yeah, and it was having like, it was pretty cool. Elon giving the tour. He
amazing.
Doesn't have time to do that these days. I don't blame him. And then my colleague met him to deliver the disc.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
That's great. Sneaker net.
Yeah.
Yeah. I love that. So NASA is planning missions to the moon. How does that differ from the Apollo program?
Artemis. Artemis is, our plan to go back and kind of stay. I mean, we don't have necessarily a base. There's a lot of things that they still haven't, put on that roadmap publicly in terms of a permanent base. But it's kind of going back and more. Initially Apollo was about putting a flag on the moon. Flags, they call it flags and footprints. Artemis is really the early missions to going back long term and helping, whether it's nation states or businesses, are going to start to use the resources of the moon to develop things that will need to migrate out in the solar system, fuel, oxygen, water, these sorts of things that we can, and maybe building materials. Because I imagine when we build some bases, we're probably not going to you won't want to bring everything from Earth. You'll want to use the resources from the land. And that's, it's debatable on tactically which methods they will use in terms of structures. Are they going to go underground and tunnel? Are they going to have domes? That part doesn't matter. That's kind of like for the real geeks to geek out on that, and that's great. But the more important thing is that we are going back, in that the moon is going to be both a playground. By play, use experimentation, training, learning, but we'll also be able to, there's economic activity we'll be able to do that will benefit us too.
So I want to keep looking at that moon mission and the exciting prospect of a moon base, but you made me think of the International Space Station, because there are parallels there, right? It's the construction of a permanent habitat in the first case in orbit, and then this one on the moon. But there's also some interesting things about the ISS that they may or may not duplicate in a lunar presence. So, for example, the fact that it was international at all, do you anticipate the Artemis program resulting in an international presence, or will it be entirely US?
I'm still not sure. I think it was a beautiful thing that we were able to get ISS together under an international group, even though very expensive, still very bureaucratic. It's aging, but it shows that humans can work together. Despite like the differences between the US and Russians, we have them working together every day on the space station. So I think that's it's like a powerful form of diplomacy. I know with like the Lunar Gateway you were alluding to earlier about this kind of space station off the moon, it would not be crewed year round or all the, it would be periodically. And there's a lot of debate on whether it's necessary. Some are saying just go direct to the moon. Why do you need to go to like a space station then go to the moon to come back and then leave that space station dark and vacant. I am not, my personal take is I'm not as bullish on the gateway. Mm-hmm. There might be some good reasons, but I don't think there are enough, rather than just focusing on, hey, let's just work on getting back to the moon and that infrastructure on the moon.
Yeah, and what you were raising earlier, the exciting prospect, everything we put in orbit around the Earth anyway, has to be from the, like, or with the current approach, it's launched from the Earth, and therefore it's all material from Earth. When you're on the moon, it's different. There is local material, maybe a barren, moon, but there's still metals and potentially even water there that we could use. And it creates a circumstance where we're starting to build for the first time with stuff that's elsewhere, that's stuff that's off Earth.
Yeah, and for those who don't know, the moon was peppered with meteorites hitting him for billions of years. And that's why they have found towards the surface levels, higher amounts of metals because of those impacts. So it's kind of like, it's this nice gift you're getting from the universe, going metals and deposits from other places that are saying, here, we're gonna give you a few here on the moon.
Yeah, that's incredible. So you wouldn't have to necessarily dig that deep to get the materials you need to
Apparently
create some
not.
form of industry there. Huh.
Yeah, that's correct.
I hadn't thought of that. So we talked about the big eye in the sky and the big, what I'll call antenna in the sky. Let's talk a little bit about the big brain in the sky, because you've already touched on the importance of space as a sort of backup location for data. But I also wonder if it'll be a popular or useful place to do data storage and data processing, because you've got all that solar power for free and no impact beyond the initial launch in terms of environmental damage. Do you see that as a growing thing?
Yeah, I've heard of some serious interest in terms of trying to develop dedicated processing, computer processor technology, even how to one day, we can't do this yet, eventually manufacture the chips and computers in space, having dedicated storage, call it true cold storage, whether it's for security or trying to take advantage of some of the thermal conditions, because in space, you could have a spacecraft on one side where the sun's hitting, it's really hot, and the other side's really cold. So space has those extremes to kind of dance with. I think the moon might be also an interesting, another kind of call it more secure zone to be able to work in. And I kind of wonder, and I think it'll further out, not related to your question, is are we eventually going to have zoning laws?
Yeah.
Or how, first of all, maybe not laws, but just how do you zone for the moon? Like, and here on Earth, you could say, this area is for industrial, or this is, light industrial. How does that work? Where we know under the current outer space, the current treaties have not kept up with what's happening. And there's a lot of discussion that needs to be revised and made more relevant for today.
Mm-hmm. Do you see any murmurs of investing in capacity to process data in space for cryptocurrency mining? Because the big complaint is it uses so much electricity, right?
Yeah, I mean, there were some early projects around storing some Bitcoin in space and saving keys. In terms of the processing ones, I don't know. I mean, your guess is probably as good as mine. I mean, I'm sure there's. I think where we'll get to, my guesstimate where we'll get to before that's necessary is that we're going to, for blockchain, there's, for those who hear about like the environmental concerns around Bitcoins, because it uses this proof of work, a bunch of computers crunching numbers, but there's also this alternative method that Bitcoin doesn't use, but some other cryptocurrencies or newer ones are starting to use, called a proof of stake. And I think we're more likely going to start seeing the currencies and tools shift to using more proof of stake and things where they're less energy intensive. I mean, they'll have their own intensive, they'll use different types of resources in terms of electricity costs. I think that we are going to more quickly transition away from that before we have to decide putting this like large computer server farm in the sky just to mine Bitcoin.
Yeah, that's an interesting perspective. I mean, I know I'm drifting us off topic a little bit. We're talking about space, but of course, you can't talk about space without getting in the community of people who think about things like blockchain and things like that as well. It'll be interesting to see how that unfolds, because that if proof of stake becomes the future, I think it calls into question the future of Bitcoin, right? Like it would call for a completely different token.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, don't invest your life savings in Bitcoin anyway.
Yeah.
When we were talking about the use of satellites for data storage and data processing, you touched on the sort of the next exciting future for space, and that is manufacturing in space. And you talked about some of the exciting characteristics, like you got easy access to super hot and super cold. You got access to electricity. You've also got microgravity. What are some of the potentials that come from creating things in microgravity, or the absence of the sensation of gravity?
Yeah, so they think that the absence of gravity, that into itself can create new stressors that you could use on how liquids flow, materials form, how you can construct things rather than, if you're building it up layer by layers. There's a lot of interest around building, I guess maybe not building, growing organs, biological organs. And there's still some difficulties, on Earth with that. And I guess you could, if you're in a zero gravity environment, you could potentially more easily construct that, whether you're, printing that layer by layer or growing the cells. I think it's going to be a really fascinating area, because I think once we have a few more kernels of like a breakthrough of like what the possibility is in one area, it doesn't matter what it is, then many other resources will want to be invested in that area, because they say, gosh, if it worked for this, but it's still relatively early. I mean, although the pharmaceutical industry has for many years taken experiments, but they've been onesies or twosies, things, we haven't really had that breakthrough yet, the treatment or cure yet. But I think, that would be a beneficial one. But I think on the material side, like how can you make a silicon chip, in a better, more efficient way? Can we, they use a lot of water. My understanding, they use a lot of water. Like can we minimize resource or environmental impact using resources from space to have these kind of fabrication places. And there's some funding that's starting to flow in those ways. It still seems to me that they're kind of like saying, hey, we have this idea, but they don't exactly know what they're going to be in the next few years. A little bit of spaghetti at the wall, because it's so early.
And this is one of the important roles of the ISS, the International Space Station, is you can have a fractional mission, like you can bring a project up there and have it done for you, and then bring it home in a way that you could never afford to have the whole infrastructure yourself.
Yeah, that's right.
What do you see as the future for the space station? Because some people are starting to say, and you even said it's showing its age. What is the future for it?
I think, I imagine with some of the recent challenge at the space station, even the commercial developers who are planning on attaching nodes or modules to the space station might be thinking, oh gosh, is the space station even too much of a liability? I mean, my own personal view, and this is, it's not the most rational, is that you would eventually move the space station somewhere out, keep it out higher orbit. It would be like a museum, because it's this amazing artifact that we've built. We already splashed down the mirror. I think that was a mistake. It's an
Skylab too.
Skylab too. I mean, these are amazing pieces of human ingenuity, and it's like, I don't know, like blowing up a pyramid.
Yeah.
So granted, it takes a lot of resources to keep it up there, but I would love to find a way to preserve aspects of, of it, a module, something.
Yeah.
But I think we're more likely to have, a few commercial groups, maybe several attached nodes to the space station. Eventually, they'll become free flyers, and NASA will become kind of a tenant of some of the commercial use of in terms of other lower Earth orbiting, space stations.
So you and I may need to speculate on this a little bit, but I'm curious about the technical and maybe economic advantages of having a space station where you keep adding bits to it, so it keeps growing, as opposed to bringing things to orbit and having them be separate space stations. What are the advantages of linking to an existing space station?
Well, I think that from my understanding is that, like, say like Axiom, they don't have to build up the whole space station. They build out the piece that they need that is not available on the ISS. They can take advantage of the other infrastructure that's there, and then eventually they can detach as they're building the rest of their space station. But when you have, potentially large systems like, the kind of SpaceX's, heavy lift capabilities coming online, you could bring up, most of your space station pre-constructed. So there's, so there's less of the construction space. There's probably pros and cons to both, and my guess it's going to be a case by case. But as we get better with manufacturing in space, with robotics, eventually some of these discussions might just seem so trivial, moot, that we're having. In the future, they're going to be looking back at this conversation going, well, that was moot because, all the materials are there, and we just, we print things out, and we do all we need to do, just, in our little factory,
right?
Our orbiting factory.
So talking about habitats in space, the sort of what Elon Musk is describing as the Holy Grail is a permanent civilization on Mars. Let me take your temperature on that. How optimistic are you that will happen in our lifetime, and what do you think it will look like?
In what aspect?
Well, that's a fair question. I'll leave that up to you. How many people, let's put it this way. It's 2040. How many people are living on the moon at that point?
In 2040, 20 years from now, I would hope that we have, I'll be generous and say 2,000 to 5,000 people.
Wow.
Maybe more. And the reason I think is that because of the capabilities and launch, I think if like Starship's able to kind of like deliver the sort of mass, they say, if you're getting a couple hundred metric tons up, and you're doing this at a rapid tempo, you can start thinking in really big structures and systems, or actually build, not just thinking, you can actually start making those a reality.
So let me back up a little bit, because that's actually even more optimistic than I anticipated you answering. So let me ask you this. When do we have boots on Mars the first time?
I think it's still going to not be till like end of this decade at the earliest.
Yeah,
I don't think it's the issue of getting the spacecraft. I don't think it's the issue of even building infrastructure. I think it's the in-between. I think it's the in-between part.
Oh.
I think it's how to kind of keep people relatively safe, even if it's a one-way trip, on the way to Mars without, psychological comfort. I mean, I'm a little skeptical of, like, I don't know if I would want to be in a proverbial tin can for 6 months to a year before I got to that destination, and then that destination is not Hawaii.
Do you see what well said? But maybe they're not recruiting us.
No, and I think there are certain specific personality types that will want to go on that journey.
Yeah.
And if they are able to have children and procreate, it'll be those children who don't have a memory of Earth as a home, that's going to be the sticking point. Because for all of us here that are live on Earth, we're always going to kind of miss Earth and think of it as our home attachment. It's going to be very difficult, even if we had this beautiful rotating cylinder, this and the Lagrange point, and we go and live there, we're still going to think of Earth as our home.
Yeah, I agree. And let's face it, we're physiologically constructed. We've evolved for the conditions on Earth. It's not going to be an easy life, I don't think. So what countries or regions do you think are going to surprise us by playing a big role in space? We're familiar with United States and Russia and China now. Where do you see the surprises coming from?
I think India will continue to make progress in the space sector. I think Africa is an interesting one. There's a lot of enthusiasm and energy and activity starting to happen in Africa. So I would say I'm optimistic by some parts of Australia and other parts. I think they're doing the dance where between like how much are they going to go into like the defense sector versus other areas, but they have a lot of legacy in mining, and I think that they could innovate and be leaders there in terms of space resources and mining because of the legacy there. I mean, you could probably say that in ways too about Canada too, because it has long history in terms of experience in mining and resources.
Yeah, that'll be interesting to see more coming from Canada. And of course, you are. I appreciate you recognizing that I'm living in Canada. So thank you for that. I don't know. Forgive me. I took this note out of your book. I don't know if it's your words or if you were quoting someone, but you say space is still in its own league. The sector is vast, intricate, and fraught with market, regulatory, and technological risks. Most investors typically only want to deal with one of those risks. Space has all three. Do you see a future where maybe one or two of those start to become, we've ticked those boxes and now it's just market issues that we need to address?
Almost high probability. Yeah. I mean, maybe they're all there, but just to reduced amounts: market risk, technology risk, regulatory risk. You could see how space could still have some of those three, but they might be that if it was like a graph, it would be doing a little dance, Oh, this administration, they want to like ratchet up, they want to put some new regulations, so there's more political risk or regulatory risk. Mars, okay, we have this technology works, but this is a new market, how do we commercialize it?
Yeah, okay, that's good. So that's encouraging.
That's my answer.
That's why it's early days, right? And that's why we're sort of saying that it's a $1 trillion market, because there are these pressures tamping down interest. But as those pressures become relieved, I think you're going to see a boom.
And I talk about how, and I got this. This is a big idea that only space can do quadrillions, because humanity's never done anything at that sort of scale. But when you talk about the vastness of the solar system and beyond, you can do things in those sorts of numbers, and that maybe it freaks, maybe it scares people, maybe inspires them, but just sit with that.
Yeah, sure. It's like imagine if there was another unutilized continent on Earth, and you were able to be one of the first companies to settle it and find resources there and build industry there. It's an enormous opportunity. It really is.
Yeah. I was looking at the Wikipedia page a couple of weeks ago for the treaty of the sale of the Alaska Purchase from the United States from Russia. And at the time, Russia did not know that there was gold and all the other resources, but you would have, and they didn't, I mean, it was a lot of money back then. It was like $18 million or something like that. 8 million or 18 million, somewhere in between there, which is a lot of money back then. But still, for what they gave up, even if there was no gold, just in terms of the beauty and saying, look, parks, tourism, I'm still kind of amazed that that was sold. And I think space has this sort of thing that there's these things, it's kind of like it's right there. We don't even recognize like how it's not even just about like commercializing, just the fact that we're going to have like people like doing what we do here on Earth, but like, playing and just in space, in the solar system. I think people start thinking as if we're going to be migrating.
Right.
People sometimes talk about the word settle and colonizing, which I know are can be very inflammatory words and they're debatable. So I've started shifting to using the word migration. And migrations don't always happen one way. Birds can go north, south, east, west. They're seasonal. We might eventually go off to the moon for a vacation or spend a longer term stay, but come back to Earth. Or there might be those who will be living most of their life on the moon, but they'll go for a visit to the Earth and come back to their, other non-celestial place of origin.
Yeah, and I think the idea of the Alaska Purchase is a very apt comparison, because at the time, Alaska was hard to get to, hard to settle. There was no 7-Eleven, there was no gas station, like there was nothing. It was barren.
No Tim Horton.
No Tim Hortons, exactly. I'm not moving there. And yet it could have, it had the potential in the future once the technology allowed and the economic activity allowed. And that is we're just at the edge of that happening in space.
And something I played around with it, this idea, I read some papers on this, on the, and I can't think of the author right now, but they were talking about there's a fund in Alaska that the government has called the Alaska Oil Impact Fund, something like that, or essentially every citizen of the state of Alaska, if there is a profit made, they get a check. Some years they do better than others. And I thought, I was like, God, wouldn't it be cool? And this is, if, the resources, somebody finds, they're taking some resources from an asteroid, and that the entrepreneur should be properly, compensated for their risk, and the investors and entrepreneurs that risked. But if there was a way to create some type of fund where like everyone on the planet Earth could also like benefit from that, and that's like difficult to execute. But I think, if we had things like with blockchain, you actually maybe could, where like every individual has like this address, and there's like money allocated to that address, and people can choose whether or not how they want that to spend that. So I think sometimes I like to play in those ideas of pushing the envelope, even if it's not very realistic or at this point, what you can kind of do with the solar system.
So that's fascinating, because I rarely tweet, and when I do, I rarely get a response. But I responded to somebody else's tweet who said basically something to the effect of, I don't see a mutiny or a revolution on Mars, because you don't see any mutinies on the International Space Station. You don't see battle. Like basically what the argument was is we're going to be more civilized once we get to space. But what you're saying it says to me that it almost writes a future where the Martians rebel because they don't want to pay us our little stipend on Earth.
That is true. That is true. And you could see that it's a kind of a polar extreme, but in the TV show and the book series, The Expanse,
yes,
the Martians are very pissed off people. They are very unhappy, and they've evolved to be a militarized authority. And you could see potentially new IP being developed in another place off planet Earth, and those developers, the IP, saying, I don't want to give a royalty back to, I don't want to pay a tax back then. So I think these are fair discussion points, how humans can hopefully behave more civilly to address those and come to compromise. that remains to be seen.
In the same exchange, the point I raised, I don't know if you're familiar with a YouTube channel called Economics Explained.
I have seen it, but I don't think I have it bookmarked.
Okay, well,
But I have seen it.
they have one episode where they explain, or at least they explore the notion that cold countries tend to be more affluent. They have higher GDPs, and the argument basically boils down to winter's hard, and so winter forces you to industrialize so that you have food and shelter in the winter. Well, imagine then what a civilization on Mars would have to accomplish. And once they've accomplished it, they would create technologies and economic might that might exceed our own.
Yeah.
It's a really interesting future to speculate on. I've kept you so long. It's already been like the whole duration. I only have 2 questions left.
Sure.
Thank you so much for your generosity. I appreciate your time. So the penultimate question is about you attending the International Space University, where you wrote a paper titled "Solving Land Rights Challenges Using Space." Let me start again. Solving land rights challenges using satellite geospatial data and the blockchain. That is a very intriguing title. What are some of the findings in that research?
Well, I co-wrote that with Kartik Kumar, and he's based in the Netherlands. And we looked at potentially trying to commercialize this idea of there are millions, if not potentially greater than 1 billion more people who still don't have secure rights to their own land. Or there's ambiguities because, someone's on their land. It's not every place has really well-defined things like boundaries and maps. I mean, and people's security to their land is actually quite important towards financial independence and getting out of poverty. And we thought, in some of these places, maybe you could start using different types of geospatial data. There's places where maps have been changed, and there's even issues like deal with fraud and corruption. But if you're able to sort of take some of these records and put them on blockchains and just more secure them, so that if it was tampered with, you would at least know it had been tampered. What we found in our attempt to try to commercially explore and develop something like this was that the challenge wasn't so much more technological, but was more political and social. That, governments not willing to use some of these new technologies, yet there's sometimes places where there's so much customary law. It's very difficult as an outsider to come in and basically say, I have this technology, you all must use it, or you all need to use it. And they're like, "What? We've been here for a long time. Who are you?"
Yeah.
So that was kind of part of the fun.
I read somewhere, I forget what this is over a decade ago that I read this, but they were describing how in some countries you only know you've gone from one property to another because a different dog is barking. So wow. It's like property rights are secured on the dog chain, not the blockchain.
Well, that's very interesting point. So technology doesn't solve everything. It's just a matter of, again, it's like being kind of open when you're first doing discovery. This was a perfect example. We had this kind of an academic paper. We looked at seeing where it could potentially be productized or commercialized, and we realized it wasn't the right timing.
I think it's an excellent premise. I hope you get to dust that off and find another use for it, because maybe it doesn't have to be global. Maybe it can be many countries.
Yeah, I mean, there was something we had learned, like in the process. The UN had a pilot program where I think in Thailand with farmers, they were giving them tablets and they were just sort of taking photos of their land. Some. I mean, there were a lot of different pilot programs, but some things were kind of as basic as that, and that didn't necessitate a lot of other expensive technology. Yeah,
you're right. You have to really adjust to your environment. So my last question. You wrote, I'm pretty sure this is your line. I'm sorry I keep doing that, but I took notes as I read the book and yeah. I forget where to attribute it. But the relationship between science fiction and science fact in this case has been an incredible two-way street. And this is a reference to Star Trek and what's actually happening in the world. That there's been this interplay of people saying, imagining a future and putting it into fiction, and then people trying to imagine a future and getting inspiration from fiction. So what is science fiction now that you're most excited about seeing in the near future in space?
I think artificial gravity, because like how many science fiction space-based shows do we watch? Last night I was watching Voyager with my wife, and I'm always like thinking, going, okay, they never really talk about how are they addressing the gravity issue. It just never, there's always, or if it's addressed, it's just we have a magic button. At least it's an Expanse, they've got like their magnetic shoes,
rotation.
they do, rotation. I think it's kind of time that we start experimenting with building some different variable gravity structures, even if they can be small, so we can put some small mammals in them, and have different Martian gravity, Earth gravity, Moon gravity. But I would like to see my lifetime, sort of an O'Neill-like structure built. I mean, that's kind of, I think that would be my personal request.
For sure. Excellent choice. Thank you very much, Robert, for being on the show.
Yeah, thank you, Tim. It was a lot of fun.
It's my pleasure. My guest today was Robert Jacobson. A link to Robert's book, Space is Open for Business, will be in the show notes. My name is Tim Hampton, and you can reach me at tim@unusuallywellinformed.com. Thanks for listening. I hope you will subscribe and join me for the next show with another unusually well-informed leader in business and technology.
Thank you for listening to the Unusually Well-Informed podcast.
The opinions expressed by the host and guests on the Unusually Well-Informed podcast are their own and do not reflect that of their employer or any other affiliation.